the Biden administration is thinking about maybe canceling some student loan debt. Let's go ahead and put this Wall Street Journal article up on the screen. They say Biden seriously considering student loan forgiveness. Officials say president may be warming to take executive action to erase at least some loan debt. Some Democrats believe a move would motivate young voters in midterms. Basically what happened is he was in one of these caucus meetings and didn't detail his plans, but responded positively when lawmakers pushed him to forgive $10,000 in student debt. The people said, suggesting they would be happy with his final decision. He also indicated he's open to further extending the current pause on student loan payments, which is set to expire on August 31st. Obviously, this is a massive issue just because the astronomical amounts of debt that are held by student loan debt holders. About 40 million people owe around $1.6 trillion in federal student debt. That makes up around 90% of student debt outstanding. So just pointing out there, this obviously, whatever Biden would do would only apply to the debt that's held by the government. That makes up about 90% of student debt outstanding. The politics of this, let's go ahead and put this insider report up on the screen. So the reason that they are at long last considering this move is because young people are not happy with the Biden administration and are extraordinarily apathetic about whether they're going to vote in the midterms. But you have a Harvard poll that found 85% of young Americans wanting Biden to take some form of action on student debt. The flip side of that is in this Harvard poll, which is actually interesting, worth digging into in and of itself, but they found 42% of voters under 30 don't believe their votes make a real difference. And part of that is because, you know, whatever, and we're going to debate the merits of this particular proposal in a moment, but whatever you think of it, Biden did promise to do something on student loan debt, has all of the power at his disposal to do something about student loan debt, made that promise on the campaign trail very popular with young voters, and then here we are, and he still hasn't done it. So gee, I wonder why so many young voters feel like their votes don't make a real difference. And again, to the question of, you know, how this may impact them politically, go ahead and put this up on the screen. Biden's approval with voters under 30 now drops to 41%. Now, this was one of the strongest groups that helped to elect him president. You know, he won young voters overwhelmingly. At the beginning of his presidency, his highest approval ratings came among this youngest demographic. And now, as I covered last week, that has completely flipped. So actually, Biden's approval rating is best with the oldest age demographic and worst with young voters. So they're looking at the midterms saying, guys, it looks like we are completely screwed. What can we possibly do? Joe Manchin continues to jerk us around and build back better, and that seems like as hopeless as it ever has. So this is something in our power. Geez, maybe we should actually do something at this point. Now, I do think the politics here are a little bit more complicated. For one thing, young voters, not particularly reliable midterm voters or otherwise, but particularly in the midterms. I do think that there is, you know, the backlash or the argument against this is basically like, well, what about people who aren't college student loan holders?
Right.
And the other question, which our friend Philip asked Jen Psaki, is about, okay, well, what about people who, you know, worked hard and their parents scrimped and saved and they actually paid off their student loan debt? Aren't they kind of getting a raw deal? Let's take a listen to that question.
Follow up on the student loan forgiveness. You said that the president is looking at a range of options with regards to canceling some student debt, but is the president looking at any options for those students and parents who saved and sacrificed so that they wouldn't have to take out such massive loans? Is he looking at including them in relief retroactively? How would they be made whole if there was some sort of canceling of debt?
You mean for people who have paid off all of their student loans?
Who made sacrifices so that they wouldn't have to take out some of those loans?
It's a good question. What I can tell you at this point is that there's legislation he'd be happy to sign for individuals who have $10,000 in existing student debt. If Congress wanted to send that to him, he'd be happy to sign it, and he's looking at executive actions and authorities. But I don't have anything to preview on that front.
So I think those two things are potentially politically potent. Both the question.
Fair questions.
It's definitely a fair question. I will point out on the substance, and I want to get your thought on the politics, and then we can talk more about, like, you know, who actually would benefit and some of the details behind this. But you already do have subsidies for people who are higher wealth and able to save in advance for their kids' college. So you have covered out and 529 education savings accounts so that you can have tuition functioning as a tax advantage intergenerational transfer. So you actually do already have subsidies in place for those parents that Phil is talking about there who are able to save in advance for their kids' education. So in fact, you know, the system is kind of unfair right now towards those who don't have the ability to save in advance and have to take out these massive student loans. But on the politics of it, I think it is overwhelmingly popular with young voters who disproportionately are the ones who are burdened by the student loan debt, who feel their futures are constrained by the amount of debt that they oftentimes graduate college with, who were sold this bill of goods of like, you know, the answer to everything is to get a college education. I think that's particularly true of Black Americans who were told basically like, this is the way to build wealth, this is the way to close the racial wealth gap. And ultimately, you know, it didn't end up being the certain ticket that they thought it would be. And because the costs are so outrageous, they've been saddled with something for life. So for young voters, do I think it will help? Maybe, marginally at this point. But I do think the overall politics are a little more fraught than maybe people would want to, people with my ideological view would want to.
I'm glad you could say that. I mean, because I do think that this is an important point. More than half of young people did not go to college. And so look, I believe I think the people who got saddled with student debt got sold a bill of goods. But you know who I blame the bill of goods for? The university system. So bailing out the university system, who continues to bilk these kids, not have any, you know, actual stake in how they're doing, and also not change university financing. Let's be honest too. Where is the major bloat coming in university budgets that's increasing tuition? Diversity and inclusion initiatives. So we should all bail out the diversity departments of Yale, Harvard,
Is that
Texas
true?
A&M.
I just genuinely don't know that. I know administration overall. So I don't know that I have seen any numbers that back up that the overwhelming amount of the bloat is for
Let's just say it's all administration. You can ask yourself where most administrative costs, new cost is being outlaid to. And I say as both my parents work in university
There's been escalation in administration for many years.
Oh, absolutely.
But
I'm talking in the last 10 years,
Right.
which is also when the highest spike has also been. So
But I think the most valid critique and the most good faith critique here is the idea of like, okay, but what then?
yeah,
Right, you do this.
That's my
you do this one-time thing. Now, for me personally, because I do think that this is such an outrageous situation and a relatively new one too. I mean, it's easy for us to forget because we've always come of age during a time when college tuition is fucking insane. But this is actually a really new phenomenon of it being so insanely expensive that no one could hope to be. Very few people could hope to be able to actually afford it up front. And since it is such a burden. That really does weigh down younger generations. And we've talked here about how, you know, this sets everybody back from being able to own a home, from being able to start a family. Student loan debt really puts this weight on top of both millennials and Gen Z that it is worth some sort of solution, even if it is, you know, not 100% of what you would ultimately want. So what I would say is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is the tool that is at their disposal. This would provide tremendous relief for, you know, millions and millions of people. And so I do think it's worth pursuing, even as I acknowledge it's nowhere near a complete solution without those other reforms that you're talking about.
My point would be, first of all, I think it would be a political disaster because I think a lot of people will feel slighted. But two, is that, like, and I should also be clear, I actually believe in very for student loan forgiveness. However, it has to be paired with the complete change in the financing system of the universities. Number two, we can never let this happen again. I was looking at some of the data. Even if you wipe out $1.9 trillion in debt, the debt load in about 5 to 10 years would also be $1.9 trillion. So what? We're going to wipe it out again?
Yeah, do it again.
No, but we can't do that because we're just bailing out the university system.
So, but that's just an argument for, you know, okay, you do this and then you have to actually reform, you have to have, you know, I personally think we should have free public college, public university at this point, or at least very affordable. So that's just an argument for this isn't the end all be all, this is just the beginning. But I think again, to say, well, it's not perfect and it doesn't actually solve the whole problem, so let's just forget about it. Well, that denies a lot of people relief right now that would be very beneficial to them. And so we have some stats that, you know, kind of make points in both directions. Let's go ahead and put the next piece up on the screen there from Brookings. This is interesting because a lot of the help would go to people who are relatively high income, who went to graduate school.
If you did, and doctors.
You know, and this is if you did complete debt cancellation. So what Biden's talking about at most is $10,000. Even that's uncertain. And they've also floated like, you know, it may be income based. So some of this debate may be a little bit moot. But, you know, they point out that in this piece, which I actually hadn't really thought about, that in fact, the way to think about it is, okay, well, how much of this debt how much is this debt as a percentage of your income? Because obviously, if you're someone who's earning a relatively low income, you're going to experience that $10,000 in debt as a much heavier burden than someone who's at the high end of the income threshold. And the person who wrote this analysis made the case of like, you know, sales tax is widely considered a regressive tax because it takes up more of your income if you are a low-income person, even though wealthy people, because they spend more money,
Right,
they pay more of the
sales
tax.
yeah.
So it really is important to think about it in relation to a percent of income. And then also, we'll get to in a moment, it also is very different. The picture is very different when you're thinking about income versus when you're thinking about total wealth. And one thing we've talked here a lot about recently is how much the sort of asset and wealth economy is even more important indicator at this point than thinking about just what your income is, because you could have a relatively low income, but if you've got, you know, if you own a home, for example, then you're in a much better position. So people who have high levels of student loan debt, that really puts a huge burden on them in terms of being able to buy a home or have that asset creation that puts them into middle class life. So that's why I think, even as it's not, you know, 100% or perfect solution or all that I would see, all that I would want to see, having at least some student loan debt relief will really be significant for a generation that has just gotten screwed over again and again and again their entire lives.
Let's put the next one up there on the screen, because this is also important. So take a look, actually, at that pie chart, because the largest amount of the benefit, only 60% of households, bottom 60%, receive only 34% of the benefit because of the outstanding load of the amount of debt. And people cannot conceive of just how much debt these lawyers and these doctors are holding. And once again, I just am completely against the idea of bailing out these low-rate law schools, which are charging 60 to 100 grand, really criminalizing a lot of these students and setting them up for lifelong amounts of debt.
Are you opposed, though, even to the more like $10,000 or if it's income constrained?
It depends, because once again, even on the 10,000, you know, here's another point, which is part of the reason why the student debt is so high amongst the bottom quintile, because the bottom quintile is also disproportionately more likely not to have gone to college or not graduated from college. So the data does show us that if you actually graduate, you're mostly on track in order to pay off your debt if you went to a public university. However, the people who get most screwed, who take out loans and then they drop out. So actually those people I'm the most concerned about, and I'd be most in favor of wiping out their debt, because they have none of the benefit, all of the saddle. So that's really tough. Like I said, and I think about this a little bit like Wall Street. Look, there was a decent case to bail out Wall Street, right? Like, hey, we got to bail out Wall Street. People need to make payroll. We need a financial system, all of that. But did we deal with the underlying problem? No. We actually have probably more of a criminal Wall Street system than we do today than before, because we didn't solve the incentives.
Regular borrowers are not equivalent to Wall Street ghouls who deserve to go to prison.
Right, but the whole point was at the time is, how are people going to make payroll? Normal-ass people need to get their paychecks. People, all this. That's why we did it, ultimately, in the first place. There was a case, a decent case at the time, that real people's lives were going to be affected by a complete bank collapse, which was correct. But and I think the correct case at the time, which I know you agree with, is we had to change the underlying system, which we did not do.
But
so we can't keep
I don't
doing
think it's
this.
a good analogy, because you're talking about bailing out people who profoundly did not deserve it. This is talking about people who profoundly do deserve it, who were really like sold a bill of goods, you know, walked down this rosy path of just take on the debt, go to college, this is a way to build wealth, and then we're stuck with a bill that is just completely insane, and which, by the way, if we're just being real, many of them will never pay. I mean, that's part of it too, is like,
kind of like Social Security.
The amount of debt that has been loaded on top of these generations, it's just gonna be with them hanging like a rock around their neck for their entire lives. So yeah, it's, you know, I would like to see us reform our system so that we have free public college. I would like to have debt completely wiped out. But I would support even a limited forgiveness so that people can start to get ahead again. Because, you know, the real path to the American dream at this point is to be able to own a home. And if you've got this debt burden on top of you for your entire life, it makes it so difficult for you to be able to ever become part of the asset ownership class, which is why we see millennials and Gen Z so consistently screwed. We have some, let's put Matt Brunig's analysis up on the screen here because this is interesting as well. He's got just some numbers about what is the current student debt situation. You could see there just how much money is owed, somewhere between 1.1 trillion and 1.65 trillion. Let's go ahead and put the next piece up on the screen, the next chart that we have here. So this makes the case you're making, Saagar, of if you look at the share of student debt owed by each income quintile, it actually goes up as you become wealthier. But he points out another way of thinking about it is if you look at the share of student debt by wealth rather than income, go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen, the dynamic actually flips. And that's partly because if you are weighed down by student debt, then undoubtedly you're going to have less wealth overall because that student debt is putting a tremendous burden on you and bringing your wealth down to really low levels. So you have here the least wealthy fifth quintile has 55% of the share of student debt. So I think, that's a really important distinction to make too, is it's one thing to think about income flows in, but not everybody who is, earning the same level of income is in the same boat in terms of their overall wealth and ability to own assets.
Yeah, and let's put the next one up here just to be entirely clear about what the Biden people are actually considering. So a source familiar tells NBC that they are thinking no decision is made and that any loan cancellation would be linked to income. So according to the people I've spoken to, a 10K, up to 10K capped by income is the most likely scenario. I guess I would be okay with it, but actually think it would be dramatically unpopular. And one of the reasons why I'm against this type of ad hoc type policy is we have to have everybody have some buy-in here. So I would be much more in favor of a $10,000 type wipeout as long as we restructure the incentive systems for all younger Americans. So think about how many working class young people over the last couple of years have been saddled down by credit card debt and others. If you even look at the polling data on why people aren't getting married or having children, the number one reason is financing. So again, in a country where 55% of people don't even go to college, don't even try, they also have an immense amount of debt. I would be much more in favor of, okay, let's say 10K, cap it by income, those people, all is here, frame it as like a new start, a new deal, some sort of thing for those folks. Because universal systems like Social Security and Medicare, where everybody in a generation actually universally benefits from something, is just much more preferable to me. Because right now, this is class warfare. I mean, let's be honest. Like, these people are disproportionately Democrats, so it's a bailout also of their own voters. And also, it's just, I don't think it's right to have the educated class get a bailout when young working class folks who actually pay taxes are getting nothing from this.
It all depends on what problem you're trying to solve, right? If the problem you're trying to solve is just like people have been screwed overall and so they should get help overall,
which I believe.
Honestly, I'm totally good with sending out a $10,000 check to everybody in the country and having it happen on a routine basis and, redistribution so that we have, massive transfer of wealth to make the country less unequal. I am 100% on board with that. I don't hear that particular argument coming from many conservatives.
No,
mostly they just want to argue against any help for anybody. And so, that if the problem you're trying to solve is people are poor and they need help overall in general, they've been screwed, okay, that's one problem that requires a universal solution. If the problem you're trying to solve is people have been screwed over specifically by the college education system and the massive tuition bills, then this makes more sense as a solution. And by the way, the younger you go on the demographic scale, the more likely you are to have gone to college. So like Gen Z, overwhelming majority do some college. They may not graduate with a 4-year college degree, which gets to your point of like, those are the people who really get screwed. But to paint this as like, oh, it's just for the educated class, I don't think that's fair because you have so many young people now who do go to college because they've been sold this is the only way you can even have a chance at succeeding in American society. So listen, to your point, what we're likely looking at here is going to be probably very limited if it happens ultimately at all. And I think that will limit some of the Republican attacks on it as well, because if it is constrained by income, that makes it much harder to paint it as just like a wealthy class bailout. But I think it would be at least some help to a lot of people in generations that have been pretty much screwed.
We'll see how it works out.
We will see what happens. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.